Technology for growth. How can we upscale the UK's digital and data infrastructure? I'm Benjamin Barnard and I'm Head of Technology Policy here at Policy Exchange. And with me to discuss this question is, I think, one of the most exciting panels Policy Exchange has ever assembled. And I might go so far as I was able to say one of the most exciting panels that have been assembled this year at Conservative Party conference. But with me to discuss this is Matt Warman MP, who is the Minister for Digital Infrastructure. He was first elected as an MP in 2015, has returned in the previous two elections with increased majorities. However, he is somewhat of a rare beast in Westminster insofar as he's actually incredibly knowledgeable about the ministerial portfolio that he's taken on. He was the technology correspondent and later editor at The Telegraph for nearly 16 years before becoming an MP, and in that time has interviewed many of the key figures of the the digital future, ranging from Jeff Bezos to Tim Berners-Lee. Part of his ministerial portfolio covers mobile coverage, the telecom supply chain, cybersecurity, and the building digital UK and gigabit delivery programmes. Nobody is more qualified to speak on this than he is. We also have the Right Honourable Baroness Morgan of Coates, who's the former Digital and Culture Secretary and a member of the House of Lords. She served in the cabinets of both David Cameron and Boris Johnson as respectively Education Secretary and, as I said, DCMS Secretary. She chaired the House of Commons Treasury Select Committee for 2 years, and she's now a non-executive director on several boards and a consultant on digital and tech matters to the law firm Travers Smith. James Wise is a partner at Balderton Capital, one of the UK's largest venture capital funds, investing in technology and businesses. While there, Balderton has led early investments into some of the UK's fastest growing tech companies, including the Hut Group, Revolut and Darktrace, as well as leading investment into fields ranging from genomic sequencing through to quantum computing and some of the most cutting edge technologies. He also sits as a trustee at Everyone, a charity aimed at understanding access to digital services, and has previously worked in a UK fintech company and on the board of a social business trust. Harry de Quetteville is the Telegraph's special correspondent for technology. Previously, he edited the paper's comment and opinion pages. He also edited the obituaries page and worked as a foreign correspondent in France, the Balkans, and the Middle East. So we have an incredibly exciting panel, and I'm sure you'll want to hear from them. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Matt. Matt, what are the government's ambitions in this area? What have you announced recently? We've had the UK National Data Strategy. We've also got the upcoming introduction of the Telecom Supply Bill. What are your ambitions? What are you going forward? And how are you approaching these issues?
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the overly generous introduction, but certainly good to be here. It is, I think, it's a statement of the obvious these days that technology has got a huge role to play in the future of the economy and the future of the country as well. What Britain is doing and what I'm personally focused on starts with the blindingly obvious, and that is connectivity, because there is no point in going on about the transformative power of technology if we haven't got a really decent connection that is accessible to pretty much every consumer and every business. So when it comes to investing for growth, the sort of opening point is not only have we got tens of billions of pounds private sector investment programme going on right now that is upgrading the whole country's infrastructure. We've also got a £5 billion opportunity from the government to stimulate the economy and to see that digital levelling up, just as we're seeing a levelling up in other areas of the economy. But that's the sort of, that's table stakes, if you like. There is a huge amount that we have to build on top of that. And I think you've talked about the data strategy very briefly. What I think we envisage is an opportunity to invest not just in the infrastructure, but also in the stuff that goes on top of it. So whether you look at our 5G testbeds and trials program, which is doing everything from trying to see what we can do with tourism and 5G through to what can we do on industrial productivity, what can we do in culture. These are areas where actually we've already got companies like NEC putting their global 5G innovation centre in the UK, because the UK has a real opportunity to do things that are genuinely world leading. But we've also got, I think, a real opportunity when it comes to the cybersecurity sector as well, where, of course, cyber is an important economic area of itself, but with the conversations around high-risk vendors and Huawei in particular, it's something that we're going to see the UK focusing on as part of a coalition of countries that share our values and obviously have a vested interest in making sure there is a much more diverse ecosystem around the 5G and the connectivity infrastructure more generally. There's a lot to do in that space, but I think it's a statement of the obvious that it's not going to be Britain working alone, either in terms of the expertise or in terms of the investment. So that is very much building that coalition, making sure that investment comes, of course, to Britain, but also comes to countries that, as I say, share our values and are able to do the things that we would like to see done on a global scale. There are big opportunities of building on that as well when it comes to smart cities, when it comes to the kind of much broader impacts that connectivity can bring. And this isn't just, one of the projects we're funding, for instance, is about, it sounds so trivial, but is about making junctions with traffic lights smarter. But that is just a little indication of how wide-ranging the impact of better connectivity is. And I'm sure there are some very clever consultants that put together how much time is wasted to the UK taxpayer by people sat at traffic lights, but it is some of that really obvious stuff that will make a difference, but a lot of it goes far, far further. And when you think about what genuinely ubiquitous connectivity, primarily enabled by fibre and 5G, can do to the broader economy, there is an awful lot more that the UK government can do. That's why there is that gigabit strategy, because it's not about saying to people, you get a better mobile phone connection, you get a better internet connection. That's a hugely important part of it, of course, but it's about saying, we're trying to sort of channel our inner Peter Bazalgette and build way ahead of demand that says what is going to be required by the economy, not now for better streaming of Netflix, but by businesses sort of 5, 10, 20 years into the future. That's what proper gigabit connectivity enables. That's what we're funding through universities, through our own test beds and trials program, working with industry. So the government's ambition on this stuff is pretty much limitless, but it is certainly ambitious in terms of the pace and the scale that we want to see it done at. And that's why we're both using taxpayer money to get that infrastructure rolled out significantly further, but it's also why we're working with industry to try and remove every possible barrier to them putting as much private sector cash in as possible. And certainly investors such as James have got a really big role to play in that, and we're very keen to make sure we do everything we can to extract every single penny out of those private sector pockets and into the UK economy. Technology is going to be central for that for the next decades to come.
Brilliant. Thank you. Baroness Morgan, you've recently, you are no longer bound by collective responsibility. Would it be cheeky to ask, we've heard that the government has limitless ambitions on this. What obstacles are they going to find in their attempts to achieve those ambitions? And, what prospects do they have of success?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Policy Exchange for putting this Fringe meeting on. You'll be pleased to hear, Matt, that I don't disagree with a word that you have just said. And I'm delighted that you're in that role and taking forward the government's digital ambitions. Look, there are a few points to cover. I'm sure we'll have a broad range of questions. I think that the biggest issue in terms of the connectivity rollout is going to be, as Matt was saying, really getting sufficient private as well as public sector investment, and frankly, just the challenges of actually digging up and having permission to dig up or to connect properties and digging up roads and other bits of our country, the way you need to put the fibre down. And I'm reminded of the fact that I spent my birthday last year looking at trenches in Coventry, and it's extraordinary how interested you can look as a minister when you're looking at fibre going down a pipe. But of course, the other thing about infrastructure and the challenges as well, one of the key bits of infrastructure, and I think the Prime Minister is absolutely right to have talked about this in the overall levelling up agenda, is about skills. And I'm really pleased to see, I think the National Data Strategy is the first part of the government's ambitions set out in this space, and we're waiting for the National Digital Strategy as well. And just one of the things in terms of, as the National Data Strategy says, for example, we use the phrase data scientist, but it means completely different things to different people. And if we want our young people to be data scientists or to have capabilities in that, we need to be clearer about exactly what we expect them to know in order to be able to fulfill those jobs. Software engineers is another, and there's lots of different jobs in the data and digital space where we mean different things. We need to be better about identifying the skills that we need. And this is particularly relevant, I think, in the post-COVID recovery as well, both in terms of young people getting careers advice as they set out as to exactly what our economy needs, but also for those for whom their sectors have been very badly hit by COVID. Actually, if people are going to retrain, again, helping them to be clear and helping the careers advisors, the job centre advisors, the companies to be clear about the skills that they are going to need to help these people to get back into the labour market as quickly and as productively as possible. The other barrier is going to be around data regulation. Data flows is highlighted in the National Data Strategy, very important in terms of where we end up, Brexit in terms of equivalence to GDPR, and then what the UK wants to do in terms of its own data flow strategy, if I can put it like that. But also around, I think, public trust in the way their data is managed. And again, the NDS actually captured that, which is, on the one hand, people are very concerned about their data being hoovered up by the big tech platforms. On the other, if you say to them, well, actually, we can anonymise your data so it can be used for medical research to help others, people are very willing to see that happen. So I think a bigger, broader, better conversation about the way that data is used and the way that data is protected is important. I think we have a challenge around acceptance of things like artificial intelligence. Again, what does that mean? It means different things to different people, but algorithms, I'm afraid to say, I think this summer's exam difficulties have perhaps led people to be more suspicious of algorithms and exactly how they work in all aspects of our life than perhaps they need to be. Having said that, we know that as artificial intelligence becomes more important, algorithms become more complicated. Do we actually understand them all fully, and the data and the biases potentially they are showing? Two final things. I don't think a conversation like this is we can't, the government rightly wants to create, and I did when I was in office, a holistic tech strategy. But we have to be realistic as well about the need to be honest with companies, particularly social media platforms, that there is some either illegal material that's perpetrated or legal but harmful material which does need to be thought more carefully about. And that's why I think it's right the platform should owe a duty of care. And I think we're waiting obviously for the next stage of the government's proposal on that. And then finally, I think the last 6 months have shown, we're sitting here today on Zoom, we were all able to log on, we've all got broadband that hopefully is going to hold up for the next 45 minutes. But the digital exclusion and people not having the hardware and the software to be able to partake is a huge issue as well. And I leave with this thought, which is that living life online is absolutely fine, but do we want to do it all of the time and for everything that we do? The answer, of course, is no. Social contact is important. We're going to have to return to at least some part of that when we are safe to do so.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And James, I'm going to turn to you next. The Minister spoke about the need to encourage investment. How can we make the UK a more business sort of friendly, a tech friendly facing economy? And what are your thoughts as a leading investor on that?
Yes, well, thanks very much, Ben, and thank you again to Policy Exchange for putting on the best panel ever. Absolutely thrilled to be part of it. So I think to take a step back, first of all, if you look at all of the challenges facing the UK economy at the moment, the digital economy, that part of the economy which is most reliant on startups and software services, has been really robust. And if you think about the risks that we faced when we went into lockdown, the collapse of online infrastructure, broadband, our payment systems, it's actually been incredibly robust. And I think it's credit to consistent governments focusing on this that we've managed to put so much of GDP online in such a small amount of time. It's quite amazing. In my role as an investor, we are also seeing more and more entrepreneurs than ever. We're seeing more private capital than ever, and we're seeing more growth in our businesses than we'd expected during this period, because we have a nation of entrepreneurs and we have a nation of investors, which is putting us in good stead. Now, there's very clearly areas of the economy which are capturing some of the upside from this digitization more than others. And we need to make sure that those things are balanced evenly. I think connectivity has been rightly brought up as an issue, but you have access to broadband, you still need to have access to a laptop and the skills to use it. And if you look at digital inclusion as a whole, the issues around between 67 million people not having basic digital skills, many hundreds of thousands of students not having access to a laptop when often they cost less than textbooks these days, it's gone from a problem to a crisis. And I think while we look at some of the great successes we're seeing in the digital economy, we have to make sure that everyone can participate. Similarly to Baroness Morgan, we're not always going to be online, but many of our businesses, our best businesses, are going to have to learn how to be more digitally savvy and productive. I actually met yesterday with the head of one of the oldest and most well-known major stores in the UK, which has been around for 300 years. Their revenues went from 5% to 95% online overnight. And they are playing catch up, and that's because those businesses haven't yet really adopted best practices, and I think the government has a key role to play in that. I think outside of, sort of the startup world, the broader relationship between government and regulation of this sector has to be clarified, and I think there's some areas where we've been really sort of prepared for this. I think financial services is a great example of that, where because of successive governments focusing on it, we have a very forward-thinking and highly innovative fintech sector. And similarly with actually health, and if you think about what Matt Hancock and previous ministers have been doing around bringing GPs online, okay, we're not fully there yet and it hasn't been perfect, but we're well ahead of our peers because we were preparing for the digitalization of some health services. At the same time, however, there's a lack of clarity in many areas. I think that all investors and private entrepreneurs know that greater regulation is coming. Most of us welcome it, but we do need clarity. And I think if we look at some of the recent government policies, which have been incredibly welcome, they've also lacked a focus on startups. So the Kickstart scheme is a great example. Wonderful scheme, I think will have very high impact, but it really wasn't considered how SMEs and startups would play a role in it initially, and we were playing catch up there. The same thing with the CMA, right? I think we all realise that competition has to be looked at in this space. It's a critical issue, but I think there's still many questions as to why, for example, Deliveroo took 6 months to have a decision made on it, and yet many of our pharmaceutical and semiconductor companies weren't treated in the same way, and it's just left people unclear on how we're going to go forward. And the final thing I'll leave on is to echo Baroness Morgan's point as well. The National Digital Strategy is incredibly welcome, and I think everyone knows that greater regulation, greater oversight of data is going to be important. But businesses are being started today that need to know whether or not, for example, all of their algorithms have to be done in a federated learning approach, or they have to do data synthesis, so the anonymization of data from day one, so that in 3 years' time, when the strategy is finally here and we start looking at putting it into practice, they don't have to go and rewrite all of their code. And so the more we can do now to lay the foundations for what kind of digital economy we want, as we have done with online care, as we are doing with online harms, as we did with the financial services, the more of that we can do, the better.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, James. So much to sort of chew upon. Harry, I'm interested to get your perspective on this as somebody who approached it from a slightly different angle, thinking perhaps more about the kind of big picture questions at play. I mean, the UK is in a prime position to have a globally leading role in the future of technology. I was just wondering what your sort of thoughts on this panel were so far and what you might see in that long-term future for Britain. Oh, hang on, Harry. I think we need to unmute you. Brilliant. There we go.
Perfect. So I think it's a question which I keep hearing is, what should the ambitions for a country like Britain be? What should our ambitions be? Should we aspire to have a Google, a Facebook, a truly global leader, or should we be content to, I don't want to say plod along, but to have unicorns launched onto the market and then hit 20, 30, $40 billion valuations? And where do we want to punch as a nation? Do we really want to be a big player? And, for my own part, I think that if you look at China and you look at America, which are the two countries ahead of us, if you want, they just have a simple geographical advantage. They're playing to continental economies and we're not. And so I'm very happy that we don't have huge trillion-dollar companies, really. Where I'm less happy is that, or I worry, is when companies which clearly represent a technological and almost national security interest like ARM are sold or find themselves disappearing to ownership abroad. And you really wonder whether we are a country which fosters in the long term, companies which are going to create huge advantage, not just for them and their clients, but whole orbits around them. So I think there's a gloom there, slight gloom. I would say that we are, as James was mentioning, huge experts in fintech, and that's obviously had a regulatory genesis, which we can echo. So, for government, we've got Matt and Nikki here, it's something which you can just iterate, I think. You look at what we did with the fintech sandbox and how incredibly successful companies have been by getting to grips with that. And you think, well, can we do the same? And I think the big question which strikes me again and again when I report about technology is, are the pieces set? Is technology like the auto industry, where basically by 1920, 1930, all the pieces were in play and we're going to remain in exactly the same position with incremental improvements for more or less 100 years? I mean, you had the combustion engine and then on you went. Or is everything going to change again and again and again with quantum and with AI? And, are there going to be, or are we just going to see Facebook in 2120 and Google in 2120? I think that's the really big question. And to really get around that, I think government has a huge part to play by creating, or regulatory bodies have a huge part to play by creating systems, frameworks where new players can come to market, and create new companies which can explode. And, we have a very strong life sciences sector in the UK, and all these deep tech problems which are going to be very close to fundamental academic research. We're very strong in those. And so, can we harness those in a big way? I mean, I think that question of translation from fundamental academic research to startups, scale-ups, profitable companies has always been an issue we've had in this country. So, I definitely see a question of, what should our ambition be? Should it be to have trillion-dollar companies? Can we upset the pieces that exist now in the tech scene, or are those pieces fixed? I certainly think that regulation is coming. It's coming in America clearly, I think, irrespective of who wins the election. So I would say, everything really feels in play, and we should make a regulatory effort to try and harness the deep tech and fundamental academic research that we have very strongly in this company, and then try and hold on to it. And the other thing I'd just like to say lastly is, I think, given how much importance there is from academia, we need to totally relook at what is academia. Google don't really care if you've been to Oxford or Cambridge. They'll happily take you on as an apprentice. And apprenticeships are hugely valuable. And, I went to Ada Technical College in Tottenham, where a lot of those guys and girls are, really from disadvantaged families. And some of them are just totally missing out higher education altogether and going into really excellent, phenomenal computer science apprenticeships. And this idea that you have to go to higher education, I just think is over.
Brilliant. Well, there's so much to chew upon there, from sort of competition policy, regulation, the future of higher education. I saw you nodding along a lot, Baroness Morgan. I wondered whether you wanted to just come back and sort of feed on some of the themes that Harry's just raised.
Well, I think what Harry was, making us think about was exactly where are we on this journey towards encouraging tech companies to think of the UK as a place to start up and to commercialise, as you say, the R&D. But also, I think there are. I think James hit on one of them. For example, with competition policy, there are also some fundamental questions I don't think the UK is alone in facing in terms of developing tech policy. But competition, I suspect the answer to James's question about Deliveroo is because it is very difficult to analyse for the competition authorities the anti-competitive or competitive nature of two data-driven businesses merging. And what exactly and the EU is obviously battling with this at the moment with something like the Google Fitbit merger. So I think there are still some fundamental, so I take Harry's point and challenge, which is I don't think we are quite where the automotive sector is. I think there's still an awful lot of things to develop, which is what makes it so exciting. And I think makes the opportunity so real for the UK. But he's right to say, we need government ministers to challenge all of us to really think deeply about those sorts of issues so that we can be the leading light in the world on this.
Brilliant, thank you. And Matt, I'm going to turn back to you quickly. We've heard lots about the national data strategy and the future and how this government is an unashamedly pro-tech government. One of the things I was going to ask you about is that obviously just before the national data strategy was released, DCMS lost the government's portfolio for cross-government data, and that went back to the Cabinet Office, which incidentally is something that Policy Exchange had called for a number of times. But I just wondered whether you'd like to take the opportunity to put to bed the criticisms that the national data strategy was toothless because it didn't have control over the things it said it was going to do. And more than that, I just wondered whether we could ask you about, I know that I worked for a long time on digital identity, and proving that you are who you say you are online is a really important thing. There have been some slightly inaccurate reports in the press that the government intends to introduce a sort of national citizens database and lots of kind of quite scary sort of polemic written around that. I just wondered whether you wanted to take the opportunity to speak to those two topics and to sort of come back to some of the perhaps slight mistruths that have been said in that debate.
Thank you. So yeah, look, I think data strategy is a really good example of it's absolutely imperative that government has a strategy that works for government itself and works for the broader economy, because it is where if we can really get maximum value out of government data, it's by making sure that it is interfacing with, in a meaningful, appropriately secure way, with all the data that is out there in the private sector. And so the point of having a data strategy that is driven by DCMS does not mean that DCMS suddenly stops talking to the Cabinet Office or vice versa. These are challenging areas for government as a whole, but the idea that one department has to talk to another is not new. I sort of think where the particular deck chairs might sit is an easy sort of conversation to have in the Westminster bubble, but what matters out there in the real world is what's the output. And the output when it comes to data has to be that government gets the fact that there is far more data sitting out there in the private sector than there is within whatever definition of government you might have. So we've got to come up with policies that are fundamentally thinking about getting maximum value and appropriate regulation when it comes to the private sector as well as the public sector. You are right, though, on digital identity, that there has been some frustrating reporting that somehow assumes that digital identity is the same as a national identity card. Of course, anyone who is engaged in the debate realises that they are fundamentally very, very different things. What DCMS is doing around digital identity is trying to make sure that we really seize the opportunity that is out there for the UK market to say, look, there are loads of things where proving your identity in a way that is sensible, secure, and sensible and proportionate will be able to make some things quicker and easier. So, for instance, proving who you are when you currently have to go through the process of buying a house is absolutely tortuous, happens in multiple different ways, and adds an awful lot of friction to the process. I think we can play a really interesting role in making that happen. To use a much more low-key example, at the moment, if you are an 18-year-old who, or indeed a 40-year-old who's lucky enough to look under 18, then the way that you prove your identity in a pub or in any scenario where you have to be over a certain age is usually with a physical driving license or a physical passport. That is a significant risk of losing what's a really important document, but you're also handing over far more information than you need to. Your date, if someone says, are you over 18, your passport number is of no relevance whatsoever. So there's a real opportunity on digital identity to make it not just an opportunity to take some friction out of the system, but also an opportunity to make sure people give away less of their data in a way that they don't need to, but in a way that provides a meaningful boost for the economy as well.
Matt, thank you. That's, I'm sure, greatly relieving for some people to hear, but also from somebody who works on the cutting edge of tech policy, I hope. It's really great to see the government engaging on digital identity. You go to businesses time and time again, and they say that it is up there with their most important concerns. And it's great to see the government really gripping that problem. James, I'm going to come back to you. Obviously, Harry spoke quite a lot about, billion-dollar unicorns, the role of sort of, regulators, and alluded very briefly to the problems with the arms sale to NVIDIA and those kind of questions. I mean, should we be concerned about these kind of questions around technological sovereignty? Do they actually deter investors from coming in to the UK? I mean, how can we get that balance right? Oh, Oscar.
Okay. Every country in the world is struggling with this question right now, and I think that it's already here. We're already making these decisions on a daily basis, right? So SenseTime, a Chinese facial recognition company, will no longer be opening its offices in the UK because of its perceived view of how regulation will work, the ongoing battle over TikTok in the US and what decisions we'll make here about it, the questions around ARM and NVIDIA. I mean, people talk about AA nationalism, but these are decisions we're making on a very regular basis. And as Baroness Morgan rightly pointed out, Delivery was a very well-known company which had many complexities around it and had to go through a serious process in order to gain further capital. I think all investors recognise they have to accept it because it is happening. They recognise it's going to happen more. I think what people want to know is what the rules of the game are going to be. And once you set those rules, everything becomes a lot clearer. And that's in two ways. So one way is obviously regulation around different aspects of what you can and can't do. So let's take GDPR, for example. What is going to happen to GDPR post sort of the formal Brexit deadline, and what are businesses supposed to be doing now to prepare for it? It's sort of very much still an open question, as are many questions in large trade negotiations. But it is something which worries my developers because they know they're going to have to spend time on it. So there's regulation. The other bigger questions are, where is the government going to play in the economy, right? Which is a macro question about which parts of our digital infrastructure does Britain want to either own or have a significant control over, and which parts don't we? So, for example, we work with a number of software companies developing autonomous driving software in the UK. China, I think last year, committed $3 billion publicly of public money to invest in that space. The US was close to that in terms of public money, not let alone the private investment they get. I think we're at £60 million, right? And for context, we spend about £1.2 billion a year on free bus passes. Now, I am 100% behind free bus passes. I think it's a fantastic thing. But if we think about the balance of where the government wants to play in the economy, wants to stimulate growth, I think we could do with more clarity around that. And there's still open questions around quantum, there's still open questions around different aspects of biotech and pharmaceuticals. And of course, with the recent acquisition of OneWeb, there's many investors in the UK thinking, well, should I be investing in satellite businesses? Because I don't know if the government is going to nationalise a whole part of the economy. And I think we all recognise it's going to happen in certain areas. But I think we just need slightly more clarity on what those rules are going to be. For what it's worth, I'd also like to mention, we talk a lot here about the unicorns, large businesses, and whether or not we'll have a biotech or a financial services equivalent of Google. I think just as importantly is what kind of nation we want to be across the economy in terms of our digital adoption. And I think there's a huge opportunity for Britain to be a nation of small entrepreneurs as well as a handful of big companies. And I think often overlooked is the opportunity to say, actually, post-COVID and when we think about our recovery, do we want to be encouraging people to use these new digital platforms, new digital tools, and take opportunities to set up their own businesses, to get training online and new digital skills? Do we want to encourage that? With it, the sort of the self satisfaction and self worth that comes with being an entrepreneur? Or do we, as some parts of the government also say, worry about productivity of small businesses, worry that we're not creating big enough organisations, and so actually we should be encouraging larger businesses to form and not be a nation of digital shopkeepers, as it were? Now, personally, I'm pro-digital shopkeepers. I think there's a huge opportunity for people to be more entrepreneurial and use those tools, but it's unclear at the moment whether or not that's the direction the government wants to go into.
Okay, I'm going to quickly send that to Matt, and I'm going to come to you, Harry. I mean, what can you do to sort of, assuage James's concerns about lack of clarity from different parts of government?
So I think we've been honest that the reason we're doing a national digital strategy, the reason we've done a national data strategy, is to address some of the concerns that James raises, right? Some of this stuff is things where the government policy was originally set some time ago in digital terms, and there is a perfectly sensible request from the market to say, well, actually, what does the future look like? That's why we're addressing it. But I think, for instance, on the what does sovereign powers look like? What does Britain think our role is when it comes to quantum and making sure that really important issues of national security don't end up going abroad? The reason we're bringing forward the investment security bill, for instance, is to make sure that we have greater powers than we currently have. I think it's obvious that at the moment there's lots of great work coming out of particularly our universities, but British businesses as well. And we need to be able to say with confidence that these are industries that the government is going to stand behind and that the government is not going to, in certain extreme circumstances, let go abroad. But just to correct one thing James said, I think we shouldn't conflate Britain's investing in OneWeb with the idea that we are suddenly going to start nationalising whole industries across the sector, because I think that was the policy of the guys that lost the election rather than won.
Okay, brilliant. And Harry de Quetteville, what would you like to sort of?
Well,
sorry.
I mean, I think the important thing is that I don't want to talk myself out of a job here, but we tend to still talk about tech as a sector. You know, the tech sector, and I'm the tech correspondent, and we've got tech ministers, but really, I sort of think this world is over, right? Tech isn't a niche. You know, everything is tech now. If you're banking, you're in tech. If you're in supermarkets, you're tech. Housing is tech. Everything, you know, what is not digitized now? I mean, so it's not. We don't really need a tech policy for national, you know, these questions of AI, they're not questions of artificial intelligence, you know, they're questions of national sovereignty, which we've discussed, you know, before it used to be steel or, you know, battleships, but now it's AI. So these aren't new questions. And I think in a way we ghettoize them by sort of somehow bracketing them with tech. They are actually up for national discussion. Are we a nation which wants to nationalize things? Are we a nation which wants to guard its own security through AI in a certain way? Do we want, you know, a nation of shopkeepers? Are we worried about small business productivity or against big businesses? You know, these are not tech questions. These are policy questions. And in a way, I suppose I'm interested in the Cummings factor here, because on the one hand, you know, having someone with that enormous executive power is great because, you know, he clearly wants to promote efficiencies and drive tech through. But on the other hand, it's someone who is reinforcing this idea of tech as a niche. You know, we can have DARPA do everything. Well, you know, actually, this is just broad government policy, and you know, which affects every single government department. So it comes from the Prime Minister, really. What is our government policy going to be about? You know, how sovereign do we want to be in certain sectors? And chips, you know, is that sale going to be blocked? I mean, it still has to go through authorization. You kind of think, well, who knows where we might be in 2 years' time? So it's this kind of stuff is really interesting, but it's not tech specific. It's just general.
Brilliant, thank you for that. I mean, I without wishing to talk myself out of a job, I mean, every single report now that we produce at Policy Exchange has some kind of a tech angle, as you rightly say. And I really enjoy working here to sort of see all of those different angles. But you're absolutely right that, you know, tech can't be considered a niche. Going forward, I'm conscious to bring in the people watching this event at home, and there have been some absolutely fantastic questions that people have been firing into us. But I think one of the key things that comes out of this is skills. You've got a lot of people talking about skills and the fact that they don't feel that currently it's as easy as it might be to encourage both young people to have skills, but also to develop those skills in later life. I'm interested, James, in what you think skills are needed to participate in the modern digital economy. And I'm going to come back across to the politicians on the panels, if it were, to find out what we can do more of to ensure that those skills are available and happening.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Ben. I think it's a critical question. I think that historically, like 10 years ago, if you ask people what skills you need for the digital economy, it's going to be coding. I think it was probably quite a misled starting point. In fact, as Harry rightly mentioned, if you think that the essentials of the economy is now predominantly a digital economy, then digital skills are very, very broad. There's many roles in every business, but also a deeper understanding of how you use different tools, I think, is essential, whether you're in marketing or sales, right? There's a movement in marketing at the moment to say it's going from Mad Men to Moneyball. In sort of sales, it's going from Del Boy to data scientist. I think people are really moving towards having to understand and use new technologies in many broad ways. So that means two things. One is it means fundamentally adoption and adaptation to new tools, I think, becomes something that's essential. And what we do now is teach people in a relatively rigorous syllabus that's been the same for many, many decades. And I have many siblings and friends who are still in school, actually, and very few of them get access to the idea that they're going to have to learn new skills all the time, right? Algebra is algebra forever, grammar is grammar forever. It's a very different world when you start thinking about reskilling many times over your career. So that's one thing. Secondly, I really welcome the announcements of improving access to training for people who didn't take A-levels or go to university from the government. And I think that can be broader. I think that when we look at the people who are starting in our businesses today, many of them moved industries and took online courses in digital marketing, digital sales, operations, product management. Giving people the support to do that, I think, is essential, and pointing people in the right direction. I think that this is partly about money, but it's also more of a cultural issue. And saying to people, this is normal. This is what success looks like now. It can be in your 30s, retraining and learning a new sort of skill or platform. And then, so the macro point I would make is once again to go back to this idea that the entrepreneurial spirit within Britain. I think that we have failed to really champion this as much as we could and say to people, look, actually going out, starting your own business, trying your own thing, failing, learning and innovating is something that we as a country think is a good thing, if we do think that's a good thing, I do. And giving people the security and knowledge that if they do that, there are government schemes to support you, there's going to be a basic level of support through for new businesses and starting of new businesses and R&D already, which we have. And culturally championing that, because I think one of the biggest challenges now isn't access to the tools, right? If you gave Dyson the tools today with 3D printers and Instagram, he could build Hoovers 10 times quicker, 20 times quicker, and much, much cheaper. It's the support to go out there and do it. And I think that's one of the things I'm focusing on a lot at the moment, is how do we get that into schools? And I think it's one of the things the government can do more of going forward.
Baroness Morgan, you're a former Secretary of State for Education. How can we get this stuff into schools, and what more can we be doing?
Well, so one of the boards I joined recently is the Careers and Enterprise Company, which is something that I helped to oversee the setting up and then let the talented chair and chief executive take it over when I was Education Secretary. So I think, just picking up where James left off, I mean, getting employers or those who invest in businesses working with schools. And the reason we set the company up was because it was a common complaint then, leaving aside digital or anything else, was just that employers wanted to get into schools. Schools get lots of offers, not entirely clear which ones are worth pursuing, and schools want to invite people in. But again, who do you know who to get in and everything else? The local enterprise partnerships are also critical parts of this, and that's partly about them knowing their local labour market and being clear about the jobs they want to attract to the areas and the skills. But I think a lot of this also stems from what Harry was just saying about the fact that tech is not a niche. And actually, we need to. This is why what the data strategy sets out to do about being clear about what do we mean by data scientists or people with AI skills or anything else. In a way, now we've got to stop using those sorts of specific terms. I mean, rather than digital marketing or digital, actually, it's just marketing, which uses a variety of channels, some of which are digital. And I remember going to the Fashion College when I was Education Secretary, and there were young people who were busy designing websites and working out, as much as actually how designers using paper and pencils, actually how do they do it online and market online as well. And I bet if you'd said to them before they started the college, you're going to be building websites and online, many of them would have said, we can't do that, we haven't been prepared for it, we don't know how to do it. But once you're there and you can see, so a lot of the time I think it's incumbent on us to demonstrate to young people, but also to those who are retraining, actually not just use the phrase digital, but what are these jobs really about? And actually, once you start saying that actually what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at all the data that this insurance business gathers, and then we're going to be interrogating it and working out how we target our customers better and everything else, Perhaps you didn't even mention the word digital, but actually you're using those digital skills and that rich data that businesses gather in a very 21st century way. So I would just encourage people, I think those links with schools, and I think the careers and enterprise company, the careers leaders they work with, the enterprise coordinators, the hubs that they're creating, more employers getting involved with that would be great.
Brilliant. Harry, one of my favourite articles that you've written in the past few years is an article entitled How to Future-Proof Your Children. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity before coming back to Matt to get his thoughts on things. What your kind of perspective is on this, and actually whether we're starting too late by the time people are getting into sort of schools and higher education, and how.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the questions I asked, dozens of people when I did the research for that piece was Mandarin or mandolin, in that would you teach your children a language or a musical instrument, given that time is finite? And most people said it was sort of evenly split, but lots of people who knew tech said they'd teach them the musical instrument, because if you look at what's happened with voice recognition, and we can have a conversation with anybody, any Uber driver around the world in their native language through your phone, really. And you may not speak it natively, but you get pretty close, and it's only going to get better. Whereas, the robots aren't going to give you the satisfaction of playing a musical instrument anytime soon. So I think making bets about which tech is going to succeed, and then trying to base your educational aspirations of that is very hard. As James was saying, 10 years ago it was coding. Before that it was everybody must learn Mandarin. Making bets is hard. What you need to do is teach children, or we learn from children. My children learn stuff from YouTube, right? I mean, YouTube is the world's best university. Forget Oxford and Cambridge. You can learn anything on YouTube in 5 to 7 minute segments, and it's incredible. It's an incredible thing. And one thing I would say is that for the moment, the tech sector is very ossified, in that we do a list of Tech 100, 100 fantastic entrepreneurs, which the next edition's just about come out next month, and almost all of them are former city people, right? They have access to legal expertise, accounting, and capital, most importantly. These are not coders, right? They're stockbrokers, and now they're traders, and now they're entrepreneurs. And they're not technicians, they're not technologists. They just have access to the contacts and the money they employ. So you can be an entrepreneur without coding, and you can learn how to code if you want to from YouTube. So I think that fluidity of mind, the fact the information is out there, and which is why what Matt was saying is so important. Fundamentally, if you get laptops to kids and stable connections, they can learn. As soon as you put a sort of brand on it, technology, this is digital, you're going to have a 12-week course, and yawn, forget it. Give a kid a laptop, give them a stable collection and a safe environment to learn at home, and they can get onto YouTube, and they can, there's a famous story about, isn't there an Olympic javelin winner who taught himself to throw the javelin on YouTube? I mean, you can do this stuff, right? You can really do it. And that's what we need, the fundamentals, and let the kids, they will take care of themselves. I think if you can give them stability of home life and connection, internet connection.
Brilliant. Matt, what is in your immediate horizon when it comes to skills? And also, I'm interested as well. I mean, whenever one speaks to the companies actually building our digital infrastructure, one of the things they say is that we are actually suffering from a skills shortage. It's very difficult for us to find people who are skilled enough to put this in and to feed the wires through the ducts and all the rest of it. And I'm keen to sort of bring in skills that, as Harry said earlier, aren't necessarily seen as digital skills, but actually might be holding back our kind of digital infrastructure.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is increasingly obvious is that, for instance, if you are running a for instance, a firm like Darktrace, it's a profoundly technology business, obviously, all of that stuff around cybersecurity. I don't talk to those guys and they say, if only you train 1 million more computer scientists, our every single problem would be solved. They, just like every other business, want to hire the best and the brightest in their field. Some of them need to be really good at coding, but by no means everybody. So this, as Harry says, this idea of putting technology into a niche and saying we need technology skills, it's a small part of the problem. It's a really important part of the problem, but it's not by any means the only thing we should be worrying about. And I think one of the things that has held us back disproportionately has been businesses not quite matching what they want with what universities are producing. So you would say to Amazon, for instance, who have done huge things with apprenticeships, really impressive program, but they've done it partly because it allowed them to get exactly what they wanted, rather than sort of say, oh, we know the syllabus at university X is great, so we'll go try and see if their graduates are interested in working for us. So skills is a hugely important part of the pipeline right from the sort of earliest days of school. Of course it is, but we also have to think about that sort of broader lifelong learning kind of stuff that the Prime Minister was talking about earlier this week. Hugely important, but ultimately not really a tech problem solely. It's a problem much more broadly for the economy. On the specific broadband rollout skills challenge, you're right that there is a challenge around the highly skilled end of the market for that, but there is also fundamentally a labour challenge when it comes to people that are needed to dig up the roads to put in new cables and that sort of stuff. Now, COVID, albeit in deeply regrettable circumstances, may mean that there is a greater availability of labour supply for some of that, and it may mean that there is a greater pool of people who are interested in retraining, and that picture will emerge rapidly. But one of the things that we've got to work with Openreach and all the other big suppliers is making sure that the investment that they're putting in, which is genuinely significant, also dovetails with our own skills investment programs as well, so that we end up with people who are going into what is a significant project in itself, but are equipped with the skills for later life stuff.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm just going to draw upon another theme that's been coming out very strongly in the comments of conference attendees. And that's this idea, really, that, COVID changes everything. We heard a little bit earlier, James, about how, actually COVID has been quite good for certain parts of the tech sector, or they've been, to put it better, resilient. And you started outlining sort of some of the things that the government could do, perhaps, to, strengthen the tech sector going forward. I think for the final closing minutes, it'd be good to hone in on that theme and really bring COVID to the fore. So I wonder whether you might expand on the points you raised earlier, and then I'm going to get perspective from the rest of the panel.
Yeah, certainly, and I think that there's two areas here. So one, which we already mentioned, is choosing which sectors the government does feel it needs to support and invigorate. I think there's a huge amount of innovation going on across many, many different areas as software gets deeper into pharmaceuticals, as it gets deeper into biology and healthcare, as it gets into new computing models with quantum. And we even, to be honest with you, we're increasingly, as software investors, looking at energy, its impact on climate change, and efficiencies around batteries and transmission. So as software investors, we're now investors in basically everything, because the market is becoming software. But in terms of what the government can do, it has to start saying, I think, quite early on that we do want to be a global leader in certain sector you really, really care about, and we're going to put extra support around that part of the economy, and we're going to invest more in that part of the economy, and we're probably going to have to do that as a direct stakeholder in that part of the economy. So whether that means on cap tables or through a more active British business bank going forward, there's various different models for that. And also that some parts of the economy are going to be protected. Whether that's we're going to have a satellite infrastructure, we're going to have genomic sequencing through the British Biobank. There are certain parts of the economy which we believe are so important that actually we are going to make sure there's a government-led and owned service. And coming out of Corona, I think there's probably going to be some need for that in certain industries to make sure that our fundamental digital infrastructure continues to thrive, and beyond connectivity. If we think about stuff around facial recognition, for example, maybe that's just an area where we say, actually, the government has to play a bigger role and we have to invest in that space and regulate it. So that's a macro question that people can ask. The second part of it, I think, goes back to what Matt was already saying around skills and making sure people have access to training throughout their lives, and we normalise that. To draw on something Harry said as well, I sit on the board of a company called Depop. It's a reselling marketplace for people who are upselling, restyling, and recycling clothing. There's 1 million British teenagers use that every month. Some people just do it as a hobby. Some people generally are making a living off it. But at the age of 18, the economic incentive in this country is to go to university. Because if you go to university, the government will give you a loan to live, and not only is it an economic incentive it's also kind of a social one, right? There's increasing social pressure for everyone to go to university. And I think that the government is aware of this. I think it's working around it with the apprenticeship schemes and also with future retraining schemes. But we don't have a system which encourages people right now to strike it out by themselves and start innovating and experimenting with new things. If we want to build back better with a more entrepreneurial economy, I think doing more to make sure that people's economic incentive at 18 isn't just to go back into full-time education, but actually to experiment and try new jobs and new roles. I think that's it's obviously in a sad situation, but it's a major opportunity to take the lead on that now. So I'd love, for example, for there to be the national gap year scheme where you could use part of your student loan actually towards starting a business or towards paying for your online training while you work in a startup.
Brilliant. I'm going to quickly give Matt a chance to come back on that. This must be leading your thinking on a daily basis. It'd be really great to get a perspective of where you're feeling on that. And then I'm going to come to the panel to give a short sort of closing statement.
Well, I think James is absolutely right to say, of course, there have to be industries where the government takes a view that they are strategically important. There's been an ongoing conversation around steel for the last number of years, but really that conversation is as much around supercomputing, around AI, around quantum, all of that. And of course, a lot of those are going to be regulated sectors to a certain extent as well, but not exclusively by any means. So James is absolutely right that we need to provide more clarity around that, and that's what the investment security bill seeks to do. But just secondly, just to absolutely back up that point that you do really, I think, need to normalise this concept of lifelong learning, which people have been talking about for decades. It simply hasn't kicked off. The idea, there was one of the comments around when the PM made his announcement earlier on, so an awful lot of the comments that were made on social media were, what do you mean retraining after 50? It was just an idea that simply didn't compute with lots and lots of people, and doing that unlocks a huge amount of value within the economy. But it is hard, and I think we should be honest, the reason this stuff has not worked for for so many years is because it is really difficult, and maybe a former education secretary has some ideas on how we should do it better.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. I'm sure that would be music to the ears of the sort of education skills teams here at Policy Exchange. I know David Goodhart has written extensively about this, and it would have been quite interesting to have had his perspective on this panel. I'm going to move now quickly, because I know we're short of time, to people summing up. So I thought we'd start with you, Harry, as somebody who really sort of motored through some of the larger topics. Harry, what do you take away from this?
I mean, I think the crucial one is COVID, as you said. It has, there's so many parts of our lives which tech affects, and we ignore or we repel that imperative, and then suddenly behaviour changes. And COVID is going to do that, whether it's working from home or whether it's bicycling in the city. I mean, every aspect of our lives is going to be affected, and there are going to be these breakthrough moments. And I really think that higher education is one of those things. I think the way that students have been treated is an absolute scandal. To be told that you have to go back to your campus and then locked up and to be made to pay rent for the odd online lesson, I think it feels like a scam to me. And the winds of change. As a journalist, having been through an industry which has been crunched up by digital, I think higher education is about to be crunched up by digital in a really big way, and if they can't see that coming, then I can. And I think it's for the better, because I think there are lots of institutions that add very, very little to someone's life apart from a load of debt, and there are lots of better ways of doing it, and that's got to be great. And as James was saying, spend some of that cash learning how to do it. Lots of people start doing that, take a few months off, and then they never find themselves never going to university because their lives take off and they get used to changing roles every 18 months and moving on and trying new things. I mean, one of the reasons that people don't become entrepreneurs is because there's an opportunity cost. The failure, not opportunity, as a cost of failure is too high. They have a stable job with maybe a pension attached. The risk is too high. You have to be not a sort of trustafarian in some ways, to have those savings built up to give it a shot. That's hard. We've got to change all that. Government can make the incentives there so it's not just rich kids And rich white men basically are entrepreneurs still today, or privileged white men, people like me, are entrepreneurs today. And that's for a very good reason, is that they can afford to take the risk. And, you know, that has to all change. Higher education has to change. The incentives to become an entrepreneur have to change. And I think COVID will really erode some of those institutional privileges, which are incredibly difficult to erode. And I really hope it's true, because I want my kids to have different, more flexible and more adaptive lives than the kind of very blockish, decade-long spans of life type career that I've had. And I think it's very exciting, but we need to get it right.
Brilliant. And Baroness Morgan, I thought I'd bring you in for a quick closing remark with a slight eye on the clock. Thank you so much, Harry. Baroness Morgan.
Well, thank you. I mean, I agree with Harry. And I think, James, I think the incentives of going to higher education have actually, it's crested and it's now gone the other. And I think the scenes of this year's students is really going to only probably hasten that process. I think what's changed by COVID, there are things that are being done online now, like GP appointments. You know, GP said for your person, we can't do it online and everything else, or hospital consultants. That now has gone, and I think a lot of people will want those changes to stay in place. The same with actually delivering lessons online, and I think in terms of people upskilling in our schools, you know, it's been an enormous struggle, but many of them are absolutely risen to the challenge about knowing how they're going to deliver education online and do it successfully. Not that I think they should do it all the time, but you know, there are times when it might be appropriate or necessary. I think the other thing in terms of online harms, the misinformation around COVID, or whether it's 5G or the anti-vaxxers or anything else, I hope has shown people that while these tech platforms offer great opportunities, particularly from it, there are also challenges to our society, and that, as I think the panel have said, regulation is coming, and it needs to come in, an enterprise-friendly way. But we do need to regulate the platforms, which, you know, can also spread misinformation, which ultimately is harmful, particularly when you're faced with a public health crisis like COVID.
Brilliant. I'm going to go quickly to James for a minute, and then to Matt to finally sum up. James.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so look, I think that we all agree here that the size of the opportunity for the UK is huge. I hope that we are positive about the role the digital economy is playing and the growing role of digital in the economy, because I think we're in a phenomenally exciting and strong position to start with, which I think is often not something that gets talked about as much as it probably could. And the scale of the opportunity here is massive. If you think about when regulation around new technologies has gone well, so like I think solar power, I think genomic sequencing, we've seen massive falls in cost and massive improvements in efficiency, which are fundamentally going to change our society, which is great. Where we've got it wrong, if you look at, for example, the history of developing vaccines, you know, the cost of developing a vaccine, a generic vaccine, has gone up 5 times in the same time that the cost of a genomic sequence has fallen 99%. And that's because sometimes competition policies creates a bit of ossifies the market a little bit. We don't necessarily support the startups and innovators in that space, and we introduce very high barriers to entry because of the cost of capital and regulation. And I think as long as we are thinking going forward that as we regulate new technologies and we think about the skills we need, we're thinking about increasing competition, increasing the number of people who can access that market. I'm sad we didn't talk about structural disadvantages, in particular around women in technology, but you know, that's probably a panel of its own right. And as long as we're thinking when we do stuff like the apprenticeship scheme, the Kickstart scheme, about those 1, 2, 3 people somewhere in their joint bedrooms innovating and developing new things, as long as we have them in our minds as well, I think we'll be in a great place to encourage innovation and growth in this part of the economy going forward.
Brilliant. I'm going to turn to Matt quickly. Matt.
Thank you, and thank you for Policy Exchange for organising it. It's been a really interesting discussion. I think James touched on the thing I wanted to end on, actually, which is the single most untapped bit of this whole conversation is both around the infrastructure itself, around making sure people can get that connectivity to unlock the potential. But it's also around diversity. It's around the fact that if you are a white working class boy in the north, a lot of the conversation that we've been having today might as well have been about a different country. And this is an absolutely crucial part of that much broader agenda, whether you call it levelling up, whatever you want to call it. We've got a huge potential in this country to make massive progress on this, but we're only going to do it if we get people connected and if we get the diversity of people that are able to address the challenges that Harry talked about to be a much, much wider part of the equation. That comes down to skills, it comes down to connectivity, but it also comes down to a sort of much more fundamental attitude to some of this stuff, which is that technology has to be embedded in absolutely everything we do.
Brilliant. That's a fantastic note to end on. And if I can add my agreement to the point around diversity, it's hugely important, and it's incredibly pleasing to hear the government say it in those terms. So thank you so much for tuning into this, if you've been doing so from the first Conservative Party virtual conference. Thank you so much to my panellists. I've said at the start that I thought this was one of the most exciting panels that Policy Exchange had assembled, and I really feel, having listened to the panel, that I wasn't disappointed. It's been a great discussion, and it's been really, really good to hear from people with genuine expertise in this topic. And I'd also quite like to thank the team here at Policy Exchange, who've worked day and night to get everybody on the platform. The platform's worked faultlessly, and I'd love to thank them. I'd love to say that this is one of many Policy Exchange panels happening this weekend. If you're watching, do tune in. We've got some great topics, ranging from everything from judicial reviews through to the future of defence and what the integrated review is going to look like. Do tune in, and I hope to see you again in the foreseeable future. So thank you to our panellists, thank you to the team here at Policy Exchange, and thank you to you for watching.
Thanks, Benjamin.
Thank you.